Okay, hi. Thank you for joining us. We're at Kamakapili Church with Ron Williams, who is going to introduce himself and the topic of his discussion, which is Joseph Nawahi, as you can see in the background. Aloha, Ron.
Oh, but you didn't introduce yourself.
Oh, that's okay. I'm the person behind the camera.
Okay.
Invisible, yes. Okay.
Okay, so aloha mai kako.
Aloha.
As Kumu Cruz mentioned, my name is Ron Williams. What we're here today for is to honor who I consider the greatest Hawaiian patriot of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
Eyo.
And that's not only my mana'o. As folks who know me know, I wouldn't say that if it didn't have primary source research to back it up. That's what they said about him. His peers said he was the greatest patriot that ever lived. So when we think about, I was thinking about the excitement that's going on about the Peace March on the 17th, and the talks that are going to happen the 16th, and the imu, and the pounding of kalo, all of these wonderful things. We can't let the greatest patriot of that era be lost in the shuffle. He literally gave his life for his kingdom. And his peers called him the greatest patriot that ever lived. And we're here today because tomorrow's his birthday, so we're celebrating that today. And we're at this site because he lived about 50 yards from us back here in this lane back here, which is an old home in Kapalama. He was from Hilo. He lived most of his life in Hilo. But he had a home here because he was part of the legislature for 9 sessions. And he was over here quite a bit. So he had a home here right behind us. It was originally owned, that home, by Princess Ruth Ke'elikolani. Her and, at the time, Princess, later Queen Lili'uokalani, both had homes right back here behind the church. It was quite a social scene back here. It was upper high-end neighborhood back then. When Princess Ruth died, she left the property to Pauahi, which became Kamehameha School's estate. Joseph Nawahi leased the property from the estate. So he was living here with his wife Emma. There was a stables at his place and a beautiful place. A couple of things we'll get into later. When he died, the funeral started from this site. So they left from his home down to the wharf. They loaded his body on a ship that took it to Hilo and so forth. He actually went around to the other islands first. The other people of the other islands would row out and pay their respects to Mrs. Nawahi. But the funeral started from his home right back here. He was also, on December 9th, 1894, arrested at this site. This is where a search warrant was served on his home, saying that he had sundry arms and ammunition trying to overthrow the government. And now he didn't. They found nothing, but nonetheless they did arrest him for treason here at the site and bring him to prison. So we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So what I want to do today is give you as much information as I can, but I don't want it to be just a me talk at you, especially since we've got a smaller crowd, which is wonderful. I want to hear from you guys. We can't be here all day, so I do ask you to keep it brief, but I'm going to ask you to give me your mana'o on a couple of things, and also to think about, as I talk, think about questions you have. Because this is our opportunity, right? Like, this is his birthday's coming up. This is our opportunity right now to learn whatever you want to know about him. If I know that, I'll be happy to share that with you. So as once I finish talking, ask me something about his life in that period. Ask me about that period. Ask me about his cohorts, things like that. And we'll take some questions about that stuff. Because I've got my prepared stuff, but I do want to kind of hear what you guys want to know too. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. We've got this beautiful image behind us here. This was just printed yesterday. So the Hawaii State Archives has a collection of close to 18,000 glass plate negatives. Talk about voices from the past. Some of them are about this big. Some of them, like this one, was 5 by 7, so it's about this big. And it's glass, and the image has been put into the glass. I don't know, it's a chemical process. Put into the glass, so it doesn't degrade. So this is a 140-year-old negative, and I printed it from our printer at the State Archives yesterday, and that's the result. And that was even from just a 600 dpi image. We can go from up to 2400 dpi. So imagine the detail you get in these types of images. And I say that because those 18,000 may contain your kupuna, or friends or people you're interested in. So whenever you get the opportunity, come to the State Archives, look through that index. We have an alphabetical index, and find out if those images are there that you're looking for. Okay? Since it's a government archives, everything there is free. So you can take a picture all you want for free. If you want a high-resolution scan, that costs money because it's a process they have to do. But otherwise, you can take all the pictures you want free. Okay? So that's that. When I talk about his peers and what they thought of him, there was a biography written by Kahekina Sheldon, by Mr. Sheldon, who was a publisher at the time, right after Nawahi died. It was published later, published in 1908, I believe, and it's Makololo Hawaii, it's in Hawaiian. And we have that biography of his life. It contains over 300 letters and Maile that were written in by different groups around the islands to Mrs. Nawahi, talking about how much they honored him after he had passed. Just beautiful, beautiful Maile. It's supplemented with information and data and so forth. But to go through and read those Maile, you just start to feel the outpouring of love these people had for him. They called him Aloha Lahui, which is another name for patriot, somebody who loves the Lahui. Now, Lahui has a couple of meanings. It can mean nation. Lahui can also mean a group of people, such as Kanaka Oiwi. So it can be an ethnic description of Kanaka Oiwi. It can be a government description of the kingdom. It can mean both things. Aloha Lahui usually means patriot, as does Po'ealoha Aina, somebody who loves the land, right? And that's the first thing I wanted to kind of take, and let's maybe 30 seconds, 1 minute. I want to go around and get your understanding, whatever it is, your definition, your thoughts on Po'ealoha Aina. What to you is a patriot? Because today we're going to talk about a patriot. And I'm assuming, that we all have a definition for that, but I think they're not always exactly the same. There's some difference. So what would you consider a patriot, whether in your day or in their day? Emily, you can start us off. What's a patriot?
I'm not going to start off.
Scared you yet?
I guess
What's a patriot to you?
a patriot to me is somebody who stands for the nation, who believes that the nation is based on the rights of the people and the consent of the governed.
Okay, good. Sir?
I become highly skeptical when people start talking about patriotism. But I agree with your definition. Somebody who stands for the real values of the nation.
Right. Yeah, because as you mentioned, it's been used sometimes as somebody who
Sometimes.
Yeah. Well.
Today.
For you,
It's someone who's dedicated passionately to a particular cause that they interpret the country means. And,
okay.
and
So
we'll
in
do
their
anything.
mind, it's for the nation.
Right, and we'll do anything for it.
Ah, okay.
I think a patriot is someone who loves their nation, but not in the sense of the government or necessarily that structure, but that you have love for your land, for your people, so whether it's the Hawaiian Kingdom. But if you're a patriotic American, I don't think it has to do really with the Constitution or any of that. It's a love of your people, and so for that, and then also that you're willing to sacrifice for because of the love of your land, whether it's your time, your body, your life, that's what's called upon. That would certainly be the greatest patriotic gesture. That's what patriotism.
Other than a New England football team.
The cheats.
The cheats.
Patriot has both positive and negative connotations. Refer to someone who thinks or someone who is blind to a cause.
Okay. Sir? What's a patriot to you?
To me, a patriot is an individual. Instead of fighting for the government, they fight for the people. You want to hear the people, what they got to say, before we can endure anything progress towards going forward. We gotta listen to the people. That's the kind of guy that can stand up and say, hey, the people first, and next thing you know, you're gonna sacrifice a lot with that. But his volunteers will come towards you too. So again, it's for the people.
Wow.
I think a patriot also is a person who speaks truth to power in defense of the people and the principles of the nation.
That's right. Wow.
A patriot to me is somebody that lives and dies for Aina and everything that's on it.
Well, obviously, I'm not going to look at myself.
That's a patriot.
Me.
Okay.
Yo.
I feel what Ruth said and what everybody said is actually something I would apply to myself. And to be less than that is to be like a player and not worthy.
Mahalo.
So I agree for the most part with that as well, with what everybody shared.
New England.
But I also, well, not that. I don't too. But I think a patriot is also somebody who is skilled at listening, and you can't have Allah Aina without Aina. And if the of your actions and your spirit are coming and being directed from the Aina, then that's, I don't know, that's what defines your legacy, your relationships, and all of those things. And so you have to be skilled at listening to Aina first. That's the ancestors are in the Aina. The Aina itself is ancestor. So,
Wow. That's wonderful, wonderful definitions. And they have me thinking so much. So when I talk about Nawahi, you know, as you mention these things, I think about ways that he fits into every one of these. Some of the things that were mentioned, Emily just mentioned the idea of listening. And I think of Nawahi as somebody who was never self-interested. You know, you had mentioned, and some other people had mentioned, kind of a little bit about patriotism and how it can become this negative thing. And I think that's because you decide what the nation should do, and then you're going to fight for that. That's not what he did. You know, he listened to the people. What did they want? If that was the opposite of what he wanted, well, he's going to do what the people want. That was his patriotism, right? We talk about sacrifice. You mentioned sacrifice. You know, him giving up his life. He literally, and when we talk about the overthrow and we talk about that period, there are folks who in indirect ways lost their lives. Joseph Nawahi lost his life directly fighting for his nation. He went to prison, caught tuberculosis, and died because of his political actions. So he gave his life for that's a patriot. And then Aina, yeah. A lot of people talked about Aina and this idea of it's not a government you're fighting for. How Nanike used to always say, Kumutras used to always say, and forgive me, I'm not saying this is what I believe, but she used to always say, you know, she'd say, I hear about people talking about their sovereign, and you know, they're sitting in their shower talking about their sovereign, and I'm sovereign. She goes, you're not sovereign unless you have land. You know, and she was talking about being tied to the Aina and being control of the Aina, right? So you can have a government, you can be a patriot to that government, but what about the Aina? Are you protecting the Aina, right? So, and Nawahi did that. So in all those ways, Nawahi was a patriot. One more thing I'll mention before I get into the facts finally is this definition, and I wanted to be clear about his patriotism as a loyalist to his kingdom. Now, I use the term, and historians use the term royalist quite a bit. We talked about this last year, and I'll repeat it again. There's a difference between a royalist and a loyalist. We lump them together all the time when we talk about Hawaiians. A royalist is literally somebody who's allegiant to the royalty, to the monarchy. It's not a bad thing, it's a great thing. But the monarchy is what you believe in and what you're fighting for. Okay? A loyalist is someone who was loyal to the nation, whether that was a monarchy or not. Joseph Nawahi, Robert Wilcox, and many other Hawaiians were loyalists. Doesn't mean they weren't also royalists. I don't know anyone who respected the Queen and loved the Queen more than Joseph Nawahi did. But he also called her out when he thought she was doing wrong. He also had a huge, huge problem with Kalakaua. Joseph Nawahi attacked Kalakaua and Gibson and those folks that were running the government when he thought they were doing wrong, right? The moment the Haole kind of started to use that to try to take over the nation, he turned and fought against them. He wasn't about, you know, his nation was number one, and therefore he would call out the royalty when he needed to. So to remember, that doesn't diminish people's allegiance or love for the monarchy, but to understand that to him there was something more important than the monarchy, and that was the nation, right? So he fought for that constantly. So I want to read you something from the biography. This is the biography was translated about 10 or 15 years ago by Dr. Puakea Nogelmeyer. I don't think the English version has been published. I've got a version of it, but the Hawaiian language version has been republished by UH Hilo recently. But this is his translation. Among all nations, their native lands are permeated throughout with the cool fragrance and the haunting sweetness with which they will always recall the names, the deeds, and the stories of their leaders who sacrificed their own lives for their homeland and the rights and the welfare of their countrymen. When our mind's eye glances back to the eras that have passed, we see the faces of the visionaries, the experts, the national leaders of each land, from the southernmost boundaries of the globe to the northernmost reaches, and from the eastern shores to the west. And it is as though their features are visible via the light of conscience in the soul of every man, because England has Gladstone, Germany has Bismarck, Russia has Alexander, Italy has Garibaldi, Spain has Columbus, America has Washington, and Hawaii indeed has Nawahi. So who's George Washington, Gladstone, Bismarck, Garibaldi? Those are the great leaders of people's nations. And they're saying Joseph Nawahi is that guy for us. So when we talk about the greatest patriot, we have to remember that that's how his peers saw him. Yeah. In the uppermost rank of patriots, royalists, and nationalists like those just listed above, ask yourself, who was the prophet of the Reciprocity Treaty? Now, when he's talking about that, he's talking about the fact that in 1873 was the first mention of the Reciprocity Treaty. Reciprocity Treaty had been offering an exchange to the U.S. To get rid of the tax on sugar for growers going into the U.S. here, and to give the U.S. Pearl Harbor. When the rumors of that came out, that the king was thinking about that, this was under the reign of William Charles Luna Lilo, 1873, all across the islands, including church, including Kaumakapili Church, was the central site for Huikalaina meetings, fighting against the idea of the Reciprocity Treaty. People came out from all across the land and said, we don't give up our land. We don't sacrifice our land, and we don't impinge on our sovereignty. The Treaty of Reciprocity allowed the United States to have property at Pearl Harbor and no other nation, which impinged on the rights of Hawaiian sovereignty. So people said, no, absolutely not. Charles Reed Bishop, who was the foreign minister of the time, was the main proponent of the idea. He was going to make a lot of money on railroads coming to those different spots. And so he wrote, they finally demanded that the government speak up and tell us your feeling. Bishop came out with an article in the paper and said, yes, we're thinking about doing this. It'll bring us lots of money. It'll bring us lots of taxes. And we're not using that land anyway. Maybe he wasn't using the land, but people were. They were fishing there. They were gathering there and so forth. Nonetheless, when this idea comes out, it comes before the Congress, and Joseph Nawahi gives an incredible, incredible speech. Many of you have probably heard of it. In the Hawaiian Kingdom legislature, Joseph Nawahi gets up one day and gives this incredible speech where he tells the gathered body, the representatives, he said, I want to tell you a story. He said, one day, many, many, many years ago, there was this great battle between two great nations, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought to a standstill. And they couldn't, there was no winner. And then so during the standstill, one of the combatants, who was trying to overrun the other combatant city, offered them a peace offering. And that offering was a giant wooden horse. And Nawahi tells the story of the Trojan horse in the 1870s in the Hawaiian Kingdom legislature. So first place, wow, talk about educated. Talk about being able to make these comparisons in your political speeches. So he talks about the Trojan horse, and he says, allowing the U.S. to gain Pearl Harbor will be the first step towards the annexation of our country. He says that 20 years before it happened. So talk about prescient. Talk about seeing the future. Other people, look at the money it's going to bring us. Oh, it's not a big deal. It's just Pearl Harbor, and so forth. He said back then, it's the first step towards annexation. And he was right. So that's when they're talking about the prophet. He was known as the Lion of North Kona. The cherished gem of all the enlightened nations is the care and loving remembrance of the tales of those who gave their all and who sacrificed their lives for king, country, and nation. The author now submits this biography of the Honorable Joseph Nawahi to his peers, for whom he tirelessly and patiently labored. Okay. So that's the biography. So I want to run through some facts about his life, because there's these stories, there's Mo'olelo, but we should all kind of gather facts to be able to tell others and pass them on. So he was born on January 13th, 1842. Kalapana, Moku Opuna, Mokupuni o Hawaii, Ko Hawaii Pai Aina. So, Kaimu, in the Ahopua, the district of Puna, the island of Hawaii, in the Hawaiian nation. His father was Nawahi o Kalani o Pu'u, Keawe o Lalo. He was hanaid by his dad's brother, his dad's oldest brother, who was named Pa'akaula. So he was hanaid as a young boy to his uncle. His uncle was known as one of the first literate Hawaiians in his family, and he exposed Nawahi to this idea of reading and writing and so forth. And they talk about his eagerness. He became a pupil at Hilo boarding school in 1853. So at the age of 11, he goes to Hilo boarding school. The Hilo boarding school was run by the Lyman family, and that was the feeder school for Lahaina Luna. So you'd send Hawaiians who were showed a lot of capabilities. You'd send them to Hilo boarding school. Once they graduate, they go to Lahaina Luna, where they would be trained to become pastors, surveyors, government officials, and so forth, the top Hawaiians of the day. So 1853, he goes to Hilo boarding school. 1857, as a 17-year-old, he went to Lahaina Luna. Okay, so he goes to Lahaina Luna in 1857 as a 17-year-old. He's there for 2 years, and they say he went through his classes with such adeptness that he was done. They couldn't teach him nothing else there at Lahaina Luna. 1859, he attends the Royal School. So he goes to the Royal School with his classmates of David Malo, and they say he's done. Yeah. So 1859, he graduates from the Royal School. He's done Hilo boarding school, he's done Lahaina Luna, and he's done the Royal School, the 3 top schools in Hawaii. In 1862, he married his first wife, Meliana Keakahiva, as a 20-year-old. He returns to Hilo. The people of the district implore him to start a school. You've got all this education, you know all this stuff, bring it back to your neighborhood. And he does. He starts his own independent school there at Waianuenue, in Pi'ihonua. So he's there at that school for about 2 years, where he's asked after that, vice principal. So his old alma mater, he goes back to and becomes the vice principal there. He's separated from his first wife. He's there for about 6 years. In 1882, he's pushed by the people to run for president. He's 30 years old now, living in Hilo, working as the vice principal of Hilo boarding school, and he runs for election and wins as the Hawaiian Kingdom representative from Hilo. Yeah, he ends up serving 9 terms. So he'll serve. Yeah, he goes to Puna for a couple years, and then he comes back to Hilo. But he's a representative from then until 1892. Yeah. In 1878, so now he's a representative. He's still teaching. In 1878, so he's 36 now. He passes the bar exam to become a lawyer. The writings of Albert Francis Judd. Albert Francis Judd was the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the Hawaiian Kingdom. Albert Francis Judd said he stood for over an hour answering questions without missing a question. Wow. Yeah, on Hawaiian law. And he didn't attend school to be a lawyer. He was self-taught. In those days, most of the native Hawaiian lawyers, and there's quite a few in the 1880s and so forth, most of them train under another lawyer. There's a haole lawyer in town, and you go work for him and train and so forth. And Nawahi just read the books himself and studied himself while he's teaching and while he's being a representative. And he passed the bar exam. So he opens an office, he opens a practice, a law office in Hilo town, and people flock to his office, asking for help with land issues and so forth. And Nawahi becomes known as the lawyer who's defending Native Hawaiian rights on land in Hilo. Okay. He's named the tax collector for Hilo. In 1881, at the age of 39, he's been divorced now. He marries Aima Ai. Yeah, so she becomes Mrs. Nawahi. She was a lady in waiting for Queen Liliuokalani, princess at the time. At that same time, Reverend Olison, so Reverend William Brewster Olison, I should learn to say that without chuckling. He was brought to Hawaii for a couple of specific reasons. One was to run Hilo boarding school, and he was the founding principal at Kamehameha schools. And he was also brought to be, pardon my anecdote, or to my moniker, but I call him the White Hammer. Because he came out, and whenever Hawaiians were making claims on rights and so forth, he was the one that was supposed to go shut them down. And he was the one that was supposed to train Native Hawaiians to know their place and so forth. There's a letter from him back and forth between him and Charles Reed Bishop and also Samuel Chapman Armstrong, where he says, we don't want Hawaiians to attain a higher education. Kamehameha Schools was set up as a manual school to train Hawaiians to be laborers. He didn't want them, getting out of their place. So that was Reverend Olison. Reverend Olison's wife dies, and he leaves Hilo Boarding School, and Nawahi is appointed acting principal at Hilo Boarding School. That's how much faith the Lymans had in him and others. Olison would come back, but for a time, Nawahi was principal at the school. He has 3 sons. Yeah. His firstborn son is Albert Kahiva Hiva Akalani. Yeah, the precious of the heavens. Hiva Hiva Akalani. His second son, Alexander Ka'e'e Okalani. And his third son was Joseph Jr. So, Albert Kahiva Hiva, Alexander Ka'e'e Okalani, and Joseph Jr. were his 3 sons. 1887 happens. Bayonet Constitution, right? We all hopefully know that the Hawaiian League was a secret all-white organization founded by Dr. McGrew, Thurston, Dole, and others in Honolulu. We have their constitution at the State Archives with their member list and everything. So we don't need to make this up. It's all there in black and white. And they say they've created a secret organization to promote white control of Hawaii. They talk the Honolulu Rifles, which was a private militia. Now, this is a contextual part that I want everyone to know. We think of the Honolulu Rifles and we think of the overthrow and so forth and so forth. But it was a complicated militia that kind of switched allegiances throughout its existence. It was created in 1858 by the king because there was no Hawaiian army, to control the kingdom when there was riots and seamen got out of control or there was fights on the wharf or something like that. He could call them out. So they were a private corporation, kind of like Blackwater. They were a private company that was under the call of the king to come out and put down riots and things like that. Around the 1870s and 80s, they start to come under the influence of the white business leaders and so forth. And by the mid-1880s, they were basically controlled. They were a wing of that Hawaiian League, that secret political party. So they are the ones that push and enact this Bayonet Constitution in 1887, the Honolulu Rifles. Now, as far as the overthrow goes, and this is a discussion we're having with Kamakapili Church right now, or Kawaiha'a Church right now, these timelines, people often quote and say the Honolulu Rifles, were there at the time of the overthrow. The Honolulu Rifles were disbanded in 1890. So the king, knowing what was going on, Kalakaua, after Bayonet, realizes they're not just pushing for control of the government, they're going to push for takeover. So he passes a law, the legislature signs it, disbanding all militias outside of the King's Guard. So the Honolulu Rifles ended in 1890. They weren't around for the overthrow. Might have been some of the same guys, but it wasn't the Honolulu Rifles. Okay, so the Bayonet happens. Immediately after Bayonet, it's kind of a wake-up call for Kanakaʻiwi. We knew the Haole were coming, were pushing for control. We knew they were haughty and demanding, but they just implemented a constitution by force that removes power from our king and other people. The Bayonet, just to go over it for a second, the biggest thing it did was shift political power by disenfranchising and enfranchising different groups. Now, I hope you know, from 1852 on, all races in Hawaii who were subjects could vote. So if you were Chinese, if you were Japanese, if you were African, if you were anything, and you were a subject of the kingdom, you could vote in elections. 1852.
Men and women?
No. And no kids either.
So 1852. 1887, that Bayonet Constitution specifically disenfranchised. They say it in the Constitution, Asians cannot vote. So if you think about that, Japanese and Chinese who had been voting for 35 years, all of a sudden can't vote. So, think about that when it comes overthrow time, whose side they're on. It also enfranchised, and as a part of my PhD is in world history. I don't know of another instance, I may be wrong, but I don't know of another instance anywhere in the world where an enfranchisement, giving the right to vote, and the Bayonet Constitution did that. If you were white and you spoke English, you could vote in the Hawaiian Kingdom elections, even if you weren't a subject. You could be here for a week, and you could vote in those elections, right? So it enfranchises white folks that aren't subject, that don't want to swear an oath of allegiance to the government. So that's what Bayonet happened. Hawaiians step back and say, oh my gosh, look what just happened. They formed the first political party, the first official political party in the kingdom, and that was Huikalai Aina. Huikalai Aina was a native Hawaiian political party formed because of Bayonet, because they're going to have an election out of Bayonet, and all of a sudden they're going to elect new representatives and so forth. Despite the fact that this election is pushed and skewed and so forth, Hawaiians still win. 1887, 1890, 1892, a lot of Native Hawaiians went to the legislature. So they're still fighting, and they're fighting because now they're organized. Yeah, when we talk about Hui Aloha Aina and all these different groups, that came out of that need to organize out of 1887. Okay, and Nawahi's in the middle of it. He's an officer of Huikalai Aina. There's a political party that starts outside of Huikalai Aina. That's another. It's a communion between Native Hawaiians and the Working Men's Association, which is kind of like the longshoremen, and it's kind of like the labor union of the day. So those folks and the Hawaiians got together and formed a party called the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party was originally run by a man named Bush, who was a friend of Kalakawa's, and but he was pushed out, and kind of the head of that party was taken over by Joseph Nawahi and William Punahou White. Those two men said, "You're not doing enough. You're just doing what Kalakaua wants," and so they took over the Liberal Party. So when I talk about Kalakaua, or about Nawahi and Kalakaua, it's a really, really, really important thing to talk about, because I fear that sometimes we get defensive about Hawaiian history, and we say, well, Hawaiians were always perfect, and they were always agreeing, and they never criticized each other. That's not true. Hawaiians were just like any other people. Thank God, because Kalakaua was a complicated figure. Now, we all have different views on him. My mana'o, this isn't history, my mana'o is that Kalakaua came to power, well, the first part will be history. Kalakaua came to power on the back of the American merchants and missionaries and so forth. That election was Emma's to win. But the election wasn't among the people, it was among the legislature. And in the legislature, Kalakaua had friends and had business associates. Kalakaua, somebody said the other day on Facebook, somebody said, sugar was the problem, sugar was the overthrow, and so forth and so forth. Many Native Hawaiians, especially upper class, owned stock in sugar companies. It wasn't about sugar, it was about race. It was whites thinking they needed to run the country. Kalakaua was a plantation owner, had lots of land that he was gaining money from sugar and so forth. Sugar wasn't the enemy. But anyway, so Kalakaua is doing fine. Things are going along. He's trying to prove himself as a leader. He's making decisions that benefit some folks. I think in my mana'o, this is my mana'o now, he had a Saul-like moment. I'm not religious, but I do know that. I do remember that story of Saul in the Bible, where he's walking along and he gets struck by God and he becomes a Christian. Kalakaua seems like one day he got it. He realized these guys that are backing me are getting power, and they're going to get powerful enough where they don't need me anymore. And he kind of flips 180 degrees and becomes an intense nationalist. And he starts hui la hui. He starts all these programs and so forth. So Kalakaua was a complicated figure. While he was in his first 7 or 8 years of his reign, and he was pushing these projects, and he was borrowing lots and lots and lots of money from overseas, Nawahi was his biggest critic. Nawahi and Pilipo both called him out all the time and said, this is a bad policy, that's a bad appointment, and so forth. And some historians have taken those stories and said, see, and just said, well, see, therefore Nawahi was against. No, Nawahi was a loyalist. He was fighting for the kingdom. He wasn't just sitting back and nodding because Kalakaua was Hawaiian. But the important part not to miss is, as he's criticizing Kalakaua, when the Haole legislators and so forth start to tell Kalakaua who he can and can't appoint, when they start telling him, we want this, we want power, he turns and says, no. We can criticize him, but he's still the king, right? He defends him as the executive. So Nawahi becomes one of the staunchest defenders of the nation and the right of the monarch to do these certain things. I'm going to be critical, but I'm going to back you up if people try to overthrow you. So that's where Nawahi played that complicated and important role that not a lot of people played. So we go into 1890, 1891. The Kalakaua dies in San Francisco. Li'u becomes queen. There are petitions that have poured into the legislature in the 1890 session demanding a new constitutional convention. They want to get rid of bayonet and give back the vote, one person, one vote. Let's have a fair constitution. And so Nawahi is one of the representatives bringing those petitions in. William White, Nawahi, and others. When the Queen comes to power, and this is another part of the story that's little told, because we want to make everyone perfect or not or glorious. When the Queen first came to power, she writes herself in her book that this idea of instituting a new constitution was one she wasn't so sure about. She had her doubts. She thought it might cause too many problems. It might lead to this. How are the Haole going to take it, and so forth? So she had her doubts, and she says, "I was convinced of the need for a new constitution by Joseph Nawahi and William White." So these two legislators from Lahaina and from Hilo came to her, had appointment after appointment after appointment, and told her, "We need a new constitution. The people need to be restored to power," and so forth. And she was convinced to do that. She also went around the islands and received petitions from Huikalai'aina with thousands of signatures. And she comes to say, the voice of the people is the voice of God. And she becomes the person behind that new constitution. But it wasn't her idea, and which is wonderful in two ways. Number one, it shows you that the people were pushing this, and number two, it gets rid of that stupid critique that Ken Conklin and others always say, that the Queen was overthrown because she had pushed a new constitution because she wanted power. It wasn't her idea at all. She was actually not sure about it. It was the people's idea. If you got a problem with it, then talk to the people, right?
So how big was the legislature at that time?
About 40.
So did he have a lot of support?
Kalakaua in 90?
No,
Nawahi?
Nawahi.
He did. It was, at that time, at 90, 91, 92, it was really touch and go. It was really like half and half.
Because he was really speaking out.
Yeah, he was.
And
He was. It was. You know, he would win a battle and lose a battle, and win a battle and lose a battle. Yeah. And so the gentleman who had done the 1887 Constitution, the Bayonet Constitution. To back up a minute, there were two factions of the Hawaiian League. There was the Thurston faction and the Dole faction. The Dole faction said, Dole was a constitutional lawyer. As much as we like to hate him, and as much as he's the figurehead of the government, he was relatively wanting to abide by law. Relatively, he broke a lot of laws, but he had more of a sense of law than
Thanks for
the
bringing
Thurston
clarity
did.
to that.
Thurston was like the Trump.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, and so Dole says, yes, let's push this bayonet constitution. Let's get him to sign this and blah blah. Thurston says, screw it. Let's kill him. He says this. Let's kill Kalakaua, take over the government, and declare a republic run by white folks. And those two factions fight, and Dole's side wins, and so they end up not killing Kalakaua. But the plan, Thurston's plan was, give him a constitution that he'll refuse to sign, kill him, and take over. So moving forward into 1992, Thurston comes forward and says, look, we're still having problems. We're still not totally in control. He's still fighting us. Nawahi's still fighting us. William White is still fighting us. This is ridiculous. So that's what pushes the 1893 coup, is the fact that they had pushed this constitution, but Hawaiians were still fighting back. So now we got to do that final step, right? And so they plan on overthrowing the Queen. The Queen is talked to by Nawahi and White. She says in her book that they were the main authors of her new constitution. White, Nawahi, and Samuel Nolan were the three main authors of her new constitution. She is planning on implementing it. Importantly, she doesn't want to just implement it like they did bayonet. She doesn't want to say, it's the Constitution because I say so. She wants to do it legally, and legally according to the bayonet Constitution. So she's saying, I'm going to follow whatever law we got nowadays and do it right. So she needs the approval of her cabinet. That's what bayonet did also, was it said the king can't, he has to have approval of the cabinet. So she tries to implement a cabinet that'll agree with her. So she brings in new people into the cabinet, and one of those people is Joseph Nawahi. On November 1st, 1892, so 2 months before the overthrow, she appoints Joseph Nawahi as Minister of Foreign Affairs. So he's one of the members of the cabinet. He lasts 2 days, and the legislature kicks him out because they have the Hauli have extra votes in the legislature. So he's removed as Minister of Foreign Affairs. She has to appoint a new one. Nonetheless, she does get the agreement of her cabinet, and her cabinet is going to sign this constitution. Okay. So we're moving into January 1893. One of the things I'll mention that the Queen does that's super interesting is the first week of January 1893, she signs a bill to create the Department of the Bureau of Tropical Agriculture and Forestry, which becomes UH. So in 1893, one of her last bills that she signed was a bill to create what became the University of Hawaii.
She could see them now.
Yeah, I know. So
one of the last bills she wrote was with dealing with Hawaiian electives.
Right. So January 14th, 1893, which is just coming up in 4 days, or 3 days? 3 days.
2 days.
2 days?
Tuesday.
It's the 12th.
Sometimes.
Today's the 12th. So in 2 days, in 1893, the Queen is going to promulgate the new Constitution. The first thing she does that morning on the 14th is she calls a meeting with Joseph Nawahi and William Punahou White. She meets them in the Blue Room of the palace, and she awards both these men the highest award in the kingdom, the Knight's Order of Kalakaua. The last royal awards ever awarded legally, because people are still giving them out nowadays. But the first legitimate, the last legitimate, I should be careful. The last legitimate governmental awards of the awards were given to Joseph Nawahi and William White on the morning of the 14th. So, and she says, for their work on this new Constitution, and she says nobody could cause them to betray the causes of the nation. Talking about him and William White.
So, the day after his birthday, he got awarded.
He got knighted.
He got knighted, and then a few days later.
The overthrow.
Wow.
What a crazy week, huh?
So white
And I thought I
became
had
knight
stress.
in blue.
Right. So she does that. She knights Order of Kalakaua. She goes across the street to the legislature building, where she prorogues the legislature, which ends the legislature for that year. You've done a great job. Go in peace. God be with you. She leaves. Following her are 125 men of Hui Kalai Aina, and they're carrying the new Constitution. And they walk across through about 7,000 people who have gathered at the palace to hear, because rumor has gotten out the Queen's going to proclaim a new Constitution. So Hawaiians are there in their black hats and top hats and dresses, and they're there to hear her proclaim a new Constitution. She's got the cabinet on her side. She comes across the street it's at noon. She walks across the street, walks through the crowd parts. She goes into the room. She meets with her cabinet. Joseph Nawahi is there. William White is there. And she says, it's time, sign the Constitution. 2 of her cabinet members back out, refuse, and run to Thurston's office down the street. And they betray her. And they refuse to sign. I don't want to say the names because I'm not positive, and I don't want to get them wrong. I think I know, but I want to make sure I get them right. But 2 of her ministers. So they go to because they've been told no. It all has context, right? They were met with the week before by Thurston Ma, who said, "We're going to overthrow the Queen. You don't want to be on the wrong side." And not only are we going to overthrow the Queen, we can prove we're going to win. How do we know we're going to win? Because we've got the U.S. troops. They bring in Minister Stevens and General Soper. General Soper is the Marshal of the Kingdom. And Soper says, if Minister Stevens says he's going to use U.S. troops, then I'm backing you too. And then because those 2 military forces say they're going to back them, the 2 cabinet members say, we got to listen to these guys. They're going to win. And so they refuse to sign. They go out. The Queen says, "What are you talking about? I wouldn't have done this if you wouldn't have said you were going to sign it." And they leave.
Not patriots.
Right. So she goes out on the balcony of the palace and she speaks to the crowd. A really interesting side note. I'm sorry I'm running long, but a little interesting side note. She gives a speech to the people. Makololo Hawaii in Hawaiian. On Monday, this is a Saturday, so there's no newspapers that come out. On Monday, her speech comes out in the English language papers. But it's not her speech, it's a translation of her speech done by Albert Francis Judd,
Oh shit!
who was there at the palace, went home that night, and then said and tried to remember what she said and wrote it down. That became her speech, which everyone has used as her speech for the last 100 years. So about 7 years ago, in part of my dissertation, I was thinking, I want to see the original speech. So I looked and I found out Kamaka Ainano, one of the Hawaiian language newspapers, had actually printed her speech up as a handbill and passed them out. 3,000 copies of her actual speech in Hawaiian.
We want those.
We don't have a single copy anywhere. Not a single copy has been found. And we. Nawahi Silva, myself, everyone has. We've done a single copy we found. There's a lead that if I ever get money, I'll follow up. 7 during the annexation hearings. This is you can't make this stuff up. During the annexation hearings in Washington D.C., this is in the Blount report, and they say there's one meeting where they're talking to the legislators and so forth, and this guy says, "I've got a speech given by the Queen on January 14th," and he's got it in front of him. And the head of the committee says, "Is it in English or Hawaiian?" He says, "Oh, it's in Hawaiian, but I've got a translation." Do you know who did the translations for all the Hawaiian language documents at the annexation hearings in Washington? Lauren Thurston.
Oh God.
The evil twin brother.
He was the translator for the Congress.
And they wonder why we get cultural PTSD.
But the point is, they had a Hawaiian language copy there in front of them, so there's a good chance it's in the National Archives in Washington D.C. Now, none of that stuff is organized. That's Nawahi Silva discovered the petitions because she went through boxes. So somebody's got to go through boxes and try to find this her speech. But it does exist.
Right, road trip.
Yes.
One comment. I think the description of the American actions at that time is incomplete because I refuse to believe that an American ambassador would act unilaterally in the way Stevens did.
Right. So there's evidence and there's conjecture. What we know is that he was working with folks back in Washington, D.C. and New England. Tom Kaufman wrote a really good book about that, Nation Within. And it talks about, he digs into what was going on back east at the time. My mana'o is that undoubtedly Stevens had backers and so forth. But what I think is critical to define is the fact that, these are all things we need to take into context. But U.S. policy at the time was not that. U.S. policy was a treaty of perpetual peace and friendship. The U.S. minister, it wasn't his job to do backdoor deals and so forth. And so his job was to enact U.S. policy until it changed. So what I know is that the U.S. government did not back Stevens and so forth. Folks, rich folks and folks that wanted to and so forth did, but it wasn't U.S. policy. Important to note because it's we generalize these things and said, well, the U.S. did the overthrow. Well, there were huge groups of people in the U.S. who were anti-imperialists, who were so forth, who thought this was an outlawish thing and so forth. It wasn't Stevens on his own, but it wasn't the U.S. policy. Yeah.
Are there records of the cables, the telegraph cables that were going between Hawaii and Washington?
Yes,
D.C.?
but Steve Louding has gathered a lot of those. There's even logbooks from the USS Boston and so forth. And almost all the evidence shows that so Stevens was a hardcore imperialist and a hardcore annexationist. He tried to get Nicaragua annexed when he was minister there. So it was his mission, and he had backers, but it wasn't U.S. policy. Yeah.
It wasn't U.S. policy, but there was a group that met at the Metropolitan Club in Washington, D.C., which included the names Roosevelt, Alfred Thayer Mann, and a later group. And basically, they created a script for U.S. hegemony around the world. They wanted a two-ocean navy.
Right. And your
Pearl Harbor was.
Right. And your point's important. But I do think it's important to differentiate between. I mean, there's groups in America right now that are living in Tennessee that want to overthrow the government. Right. There's always people pushing foreign policy, but it was against U.S. policy to overthrow the Queen.
But that became U.S. policy.
To overthrow the Queen?
No. The group at the Metropolitan Club basically designed the U.S. policy that exists to today.
Well, to
Roosevelt.
Well, maybe to today, but what I'm saying is, in 1883, the overthrow of the Queen was absolutely against formal U.S. policy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's important to know because then you can say, because then Cleveland's actions make sense.
Right.
Cleveland was president of the United States, and he said that's why Cleveland said it's an act of war.
Right.
It wasn't we can get rid of whether Cleveland was pro or anti-Hawaiian. What does the law say? And he says it was an act of war, and it was. Yeah. Okay. So 1893 happens. March 4th, 1893, at that site Dr. Cruz was talking about a minute ago, at the post office across the street from the palace. So you have the post office here. This side of it, back a little bit, was a place called Arion Hall. And it was a hall where all those important meetings happened. And that's where Hui Aloha Aina was founded. The patriotic group. It was right there in the kind of back Diamond Head side of the post office.
What's there now?
It's part of that post office building.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's at the back of it. Yeah. And that was where Arion Hall was. And so on March 4th, 1893, they found Hui Aloha Aina. And Joseph Nawahi is chosen as the first president. Later that month, on the 27th, the women will come together and form the women's group of Hui Aloha Aina there at the same spot. And Joseph Nawahi becomes that first president.
Wait, what date is the women's one?
27th of March. So he becomes this driving force against the new government. The government actually there's orders from Dole to Soper that if any actions break out to attack the government, arrest these 7 men. And it's a list of 7 men. One of them is Joseph Nawahi. William White is one of the others. As things are going along, the Queen tells Hui Aloha Aina. Now, another thing about Hui Aloha Aina, and myself and Justin are working on a book about Hui Aloha Aina, but another thing that we do with Hui Aloha Aina is promote and talk about their kapu'oloha, their peace and so forth. And that is absolutely true. But they weren't idiots. They also planned for in case. There's lots of good evidence that while they were awaiting justice from America, while they were listening to the Queen to stand down, they were also gathering plans and guns and weapons and so forth. Reverend Hihio in Lahaina was in charge of one of the committees of Hui Aloha Aina to bring in guns and weapons. And then we know about the 1895 Kauaku Loko, or Civil War, where Robert Wilcox led. So this is where Nawahi comes to his end. In late January, or late December 1894, we've had that talk from the U.S. that they're going to restore the Queen. Most of you know this, but Cleveland had decided to restore the Queen. And it is fascinating to think about. I mean, we really did literally come within a hair of restoration. We really, really did. Again, when the U.S. Minister Willis now has come to the provisional government, he had made the deal with the Queen. He had gone to the provisional government and said, "You guys, Cleveland's policy is we're going to restore the Queen. You guys need to step down now." They stepped back and had their own meeting. And notes from that meeting from Emerson and others talk about the fact that Dole said, okay. Dole said, as long as we've got guarantees that we're not going to be put in prison, as long as we get to keep our property and so forth, I guess we lost. I guess, we tried, but we lost. And Thurston said, F no. Thurston said, no. He said, we're going to keep doing this. And he said, I think they're bluffing. He said, I don't think the U.S. is going to send troops down here, fire on white folks whose parents were American citizens to restore a brown queen. And he was right. Cleveland didn't give Minister Willis military power to reinstate the Queen. He had hoped that the PG would just step down. And Thurston guessed that they were bluffing, and he was right. And the PG took Thurston's side and said, yeah, let's do it. So they sandbagged the palace, they put up the things, and they tell the U.S. Now they've been begging the U.S. This is a part that I want to throw out there, and we can talk about it later if you want. But I think it's important because we have different folks talking about different things about occupation and so forth, and when it started, when it stopped, and all that stuff. The provisional government had been under what do you call it, occupation, but what do you call it, when the flag goes up? I forget. There's a legal term for when the flag goes up. Protectorate. of the U.S. From Minister Stevens. When Blount arrived, he lowers the flag, ends the protectorship, right? In 1893, up until this time in 1894, the provisional government had been begging the U.S. to annex them. Please take us, please take us, please take us. Now when the U.S. says our official policy is to restore the Queen, they say it's none of your business, it's a domestic affair, butt out. Right? Because the U.S. wants to restore the Queen now. So my question to folks who say that occupation started in January 1893 is, how is Hawaii under occupation by a government that's trying to restore the Queen? That's the enemy of the Republic. When the Republic of Hawaii was created in 1894, the U.S. was their enemy because the U.S. was wanting restoration. Later, in 1896 and 97 and so forth, when the Spanish-American War breaks out, annexation ideas start again, and the U.S. steals Hawaii. But in 1894, 1895, the U.S. was the enemy of the Republic of Hawaii. And Joseph Nawahi, so these ideas of the overthrow, these ideas of a rebellion are going around town. Lots and lots of people are talking about them. The government hears the rumors, knows what's going on, and they try to make a preemptive strike. Now that Kawakuloko of Robert Wilcox starts on January 6th, 1895. But about a month before that, month and a half before that, the government wants to make a preemptive strike. They hear something's going to happen, and they want to make a preemptive strike. So they sign out arrest warrants for Joseph Nawahi, Crick, and others. I have a spy report here so the provisional government and the Republic had been hiring spies. Some of them, unfortunately, Native Hawaiian, who would go to the Aloha Aina meetings and report back to the government. There's a lot of messy, not so fun stuff. And so this is one of the reports from one of the guys, and he says, for the last 2 days I've tried by every means to gain some information about the start of things in Hawaii, but did not succeed. Nawahi has been up there amongst them. They are waiting for Ross and BP Kane. When BP Kane comes back, they will launch their mission. On Maui, it's Daniels, Billy White, and Clark, and so forth. And he mentions the people. So the government knows Nawahi's involved. They know he's one of the leaders. And on December 9th, 1894, they raid his home at Kapalama. Now, Emma is home. He's not home. He hears about it in town, and he comes home while they're here. So an arrest warrant has been sworn out, swearing that E.G. Hitchcock complains and informs the said justice that he has knowledge of and reason to believe that J. Nawahi has sundry arms and ammunition with treasonable intent in his possession, and that said arms and ammunition are concealed on the premises occupied by Joseph Nawahi, being a dwelling house, storehouse, stable, and other small buildings situated at Kapalama, Honolulu, Oahu. So they come out here, they bust open the door, Mrs. Nawahi's home with the kids, and they search the property, the entire property. They don't find anything, a single thing. Nawahi comes home, what are you doing in my house, blah, 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 and they arrest him anyway. They arrest him for treason at that point. They bring him to prison, Oahu prison, filthy, disease-ridden prison, where, as you know, he contracts tuberculosis that's going to kill him in about a year and a half.
Is that the prison that's current?
It's that site, Ka'av, it's called. It was called the Reef. Yeah. The important thing to understand about his trial, which is, if he wouldn't have contracted tuberculosis, he would have been one of the lucky ones, because under the Kawakuloko, once the rebellion starts in January 1895, martial law is declared. It's another book I'm working on. Are those trials? These were illegal trials. During martial law, you cannot simultaneously have military courts and citizens courts, circuit courts, but they do anyway, and they try these men under martial law. So over 189 men, Native Hawaiian men, are court-martialed and sent to prison from the Kawakuloko. But Nawahi was arrested prior to martial law, which means he's heard in a civil court. So his court is heard by the First Circuit Court in here, and they find him not guilty. He is in prison, awaiting trial and going to trial and stuff like that for almost 5 months, and that's when he gets sick. But he's released in May of 1895 because he's found not guilty. Because, again, he wasn't tried under that military court. He gets out of prison. Almost immediately, he's released on May 9th, 1895. On May 25th, he founds Kealoha Aina, the new papal Kealoha Aina, which becomes the voice of Huialoha Aina, which becomes the voice of the Queen. and becomes the most prominent example of native voice fighting against annexation. Summer of 1896, he becomes very ill. The tuberculosis has worsened. He's told to go get good air in San Francisco, and so he travels to San Francisco, where he dies on September 14th. I'm going to read to you. Good air. They did that for everybody. They did that for Kalakaua. Yeah, San Francisco's good air.
No, who's that? Who said that?
Most of the doctors.
One of them dead.
Most of the doctors.
The one that was letting go to poison all in the air.
So this is these are his last words spoken. So Mrs. Nawahi writes a letter to her sister, and that's how we have this. This is from her letter. He says, this is hard to read, but he says, so he's called Mrs. Nawahi to his bedside, and he calls her Mama. He says, Mama, be hopeful. You may be a widow when you return to Hawaii, but God takes care of widows and orphans. Mama, I look upon you with great suffering. Please forgive me for bringing you to this foreign land, for you to labor alone with such patience. So he's asking Mrs. Nawahi for forgiveness for taking her far away from her home as he dies. It's the result of my own carelessness toward my own health. That is the reason why this misfortune has come about. He had worked so hard after he got out of prison. Just as the doctor said, I persisted in working when my body was weak, and it would be difficult now to save me. That is so. May the Lord watch over the dear fatherless children of his servant. So one of the things okay, I'll finish later. When he finished his remarks, he clasped his hands over his chest, closed his eyes, and fell into a comfortable and calm sleep. But, dear reader, the person writing these loving memorials for him should reveal that upon these shoulders and within this heart there grows a great sorrow and a grieving love, which I grasp those words and their meaning. Perhaps you too, along with me, are unable to contain the tears that well up and dampen the cheeks when recalling that these prophetic images came when the time was quietly approaching and drawing near, when the light in Joseph Kahului Nawahi's living body would be extinguished, leaving behind memories of deep grief and boundless regret, combined with unforgettable love. And of that, indeed, this pen point now gently speaks, offering its loving lament. Aloha, beloved, was his assured, assertive voice on behalf of his Lord. Aloha, beloved, was his fearless ink pen in support of his native people. Aloha, beloved, was his heart of steel, which we shall never forget. Joseph Kahului lay in gentle final sleep in the confines of that strange land, and in the failing physical condition, when the hands of the clock struck 2:45, the light in his body completely extinguished. So I want to read. So they bring his body back here to Honolulu. There's a funeral for him on September 30th, 1896, from his home. I've got photographs that if anyone wants to see. We've got some recently discovered photographs of his funeral and his body arriving in Hilo. But this is from the paper. It says, when the women of a country pay respect to a patriot, one of a few as he may have been, a note of warning is sounded which ought to be heard by the governors of the land. The words and rhythm of a song, and they mention that because women led the funeral. There were over 250 women from Huilohaina who led the funeral. The words and rhythm of a song have more than once overthrown thrones and republics, and the cool courage of women who, in the modern times, while clamoring for votes across the sea, do not vote but control the votes of their friends, are not to be ignored. The funeral procession today of the ex-minister proved that as a Hawaiian he was not forgotten. He represented a principle existent in the hearts of Hawaiians, and especially of womanhood. The mothers reared us and will protect the autonomy of the country. When they speak the word, the men will follow. Every inch of the large residence and grounds occupied by the late Joseph Nawahi was filled at noon today by Hawaiian mourners. At 12:30, the funeral services were opened by the singing of appropriate hymns. The Reverend Enoch Samaya Timoteo, in eloquent language, spoke the last words over the departed patriot. Precisely at 1:30, the casket was carried to the hearse by the pallbearers, and the procession formed in the order formerly announced. It was the largest funeral since that of King David Kalakaua. Officers of Hui Kalai'aina and Hui Aloha drew the hearse. The carriage was drawn by 4 black horses. A detachment of police led by Robert Parker. Government band with Henry Berger. Several hundred from Ka'ahuhui Hawaii Aloha Aina Wahine, the Portuguese Political Society, and other societies. They marched from the Kupalama home to Honolulu Harbor, where his body was placed aboard a steamer for Hilo. And the paper mentions, it is interesting to record that from early yesterday until the funeral took place today, the remains of Mr. Nawahi were carefully watched by his friends. Kahili bearers waved their plumes over the body of their loved friend, and many were the Hawaiian songs sung to him. The Kamehameha boys took the lead in the Maile. His body was brought to the harbor. From the harbor, they traveled to Lahaina. His body was brought to Lahaina, where the folks from Hui Lahaina o Kamalu Ulo Olele, which is one of our branches, rode out. Mr. Nawahi led them, and they rode, or Mr. White led them out to Mrs. Nawahi, and they gave her their compliments there. Then they went on to Hilo, where a funeral was held for him from his home to where he's buried today. Many of you, most of you, have visited his site today. So that's the story of what they say is the greatest patriot of the Hawaiian Kingdom, a man who, again, has my undying respect, not just because he fought for his kingdom, but because he fought for it. It seems like he always made the right decision. He didn't just sit by and say, Hawaiians are great, the Hawaiian Kingdom is great, shut up. He called them out when there were problems. And yet he turned the moment he needed to and fought to defend the kingdom against outside attackers. That's a patriot in my mind. So he I think is an inspiration for us all. I ask that you take these cards and pass on a note about him to somebody tomorrow, to friends of yours, to people you know, and one by one, the cards. As many of you know, the cards have gone out to schools. We just passed 25,000 cards out now
That's great.
in over 50 schools across Hawaii, and we're about halfway done. We got a lot more to do. So they're getting to the kids. So keep reinforcing that by talking to them about him and keeping his name alive. No Joseph Nawahi. So I want to read one more thing, if you'll give me about 4 minutes, that I missed. But that I want to show you because you can trust me, but it's better to have evidence.
Trust and
Verify but trust.
Exactly, trust but verify. This is, and I read this last year, but if you didn't hear it, you have to hear it because this is a perfect example of the man he was. He not only called out Kalakaua, he called out the queen. Now she hadn't done anything wrong, but just in case she was thinking of doing something wrong, he reminded her this. Now, and you have to understand how beloved the queen was to him. If you read his biography, he thinks of her as heavenly. Yet, he has a duty to his nation. So, this is a letter he wrote to the queen on December 7th, 1893. So, it's been almost a year since the overthrow. They're still waiting for the U.S. to do the right thing. Minister Willis has arrived to negotiate with the queen. And nobody knows what's being talked about. People are only hearing rumors. The U.S. representative is here. And some of the rumors that are going around town are that the queen is going to make a deal with the U.S. representative where she'll get paid for her crown lands and make money and so forth, but she'll sign over the kingdom. That's one of the rumors that's going around. And so Nawahi steps up and writes her a letter. And imagine the difficulty he had in writing to the queen this letter. So I'm going to read you his words. To Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani, Sovereign of the Hawaiian Kingdom, may it please your gracious majesty, the undersigned loyal and respectful subjects of the Hawaiian Kingdom and of your majesty take the liberty in humbly submitting to your majesty what follows, to wit, that they are the officers and executive body of a political association called Hui Aloha Aina o Hawaii, embracing a membership of over 8,000 registered voters, united for the express purpose of preserving the integrity of the Hawaiian monarchy under your majesty's rule, that in their above capacity and in virtue of the delegation unto them given by the members of said association, the undersigned have, ever since the revolution of the January 17, 1893, used all their endeavors, efforts, power, and influence, and those of the members of the association, through organization, meetings, petitions, testimony, and other legal means, for the object of helping to bring about the restoration of your majesty as sovereign of this kingdom. That these efforts, attended at time with danger to their lives and properties, and to the lives and properties of the members who follow their leadership, have created between themselves and their followers a reciprocal bond of interest, obligations, and responsibilities, whereby the members of the association expect from the aforementioned said officers and executive body the proper information, news, and instruction for their guidance, and expect them to attend to all the objects of the association and to the carrying out of the political measures necessary for the complete restoration of the Hawaiian monarchy. So he's telling her, give us some news, because we're supposed to be leading the people and we don't know what to tell them. Therefore, the undersigned feel that it is an imperious duty of theirs to respectfully represent to your majesty that the members of Hui Aloha Aina are at present laboring under serious apprehensions and fears, lest through ill-advised and hasty concessions the future of the kingdom may be jeopardized at the very moment when the impending restoration of your majesty would otherwise fill the hearts of your people with gladness and fulfill the wishes of your faithful subjects who have been bravely standing by your majesty through all these long months of dangers, insults, and anxious waiting. It has been announced by local papers and not contradicted that Minister Willis, after negotiating with your majesty personally and secretly, without the advice of any real representatives of your people, has offered the provisional government to surrender on condition of your majesty promising to respect the old bayonet constitution of 1887 and agreeing to grant the rebels who have attempted to sell the country a full political amnesty. Now this is another complicated point. They're saying that we hear you're negotiating to pardon them, which was true, and that we'll go back to the 1887 constitution. And Nawahi is saying that's not your decision to make. He's saying that to the Queen. He's saying that's the people's decision to make. And we hear you're making these deals. On this matter, we wish to be allowed to state, number one, the restoration being not a favor, but an obligation of justice on the American government ought to be done without any restrictive conditions. So he's saying the leaders of Huila Aina say, don't bargain about restoration. Just get restoration. And your majesty owes it to the Hawaiian people who have stood by you to now stand by them and not sacrifice one iota of their rights. Therefore, in the event of your majesty's considering that certain concessions might be granted, only such as might be personal to your majesty ought to be acceded to privately. But any conditions interesting the whole nation, such as those especially of constitution and amnesty, ought not to be granted except after due consultation with the representatives of your people. In the event of your majesty not considering your present cabinet as representing the nation, we claim that the nearest and most authoritative representatives of the people in the present circumstance are the officers of Hui Aloha Aina, who have proved their loyalty to your person and their discretion and trustworthiness. Moreover, your majesty should remember that the entering by you in your official capacity into any secret agreement with Minister Willis would be a violation of all constitutional principles. It would not be binding on your restored cabinet, nor on any other that might follow who has executive power, would be responsible to the people for such agreements and their fearful consequences taken without their previous consent. In the matter of the Constitution, apart from the desires and expectations of the Hawaiian people for a new instrument canceling the injustices of the last one, which has virtually been abrogated by the rebels themselves, your majesty should consider the consequences to yourself and to your people resulting from the restoration of the old constitution. You must admit that through the odious and unjust property qualifications, which has disenfranchised your native subjects in their own country and given virtual control of the elections to the moneyed classes, those mortal enemies of your majesty and your people, the old constitution would again give back to those same enemies the legislative power of the land, which they would soon control again through their former money tactics. The question of amnesty is equally dangerous, and gets more so when combined with the constitutional one, since this would confirm to all the present rebels and enemies of our autonomy all their civil rights of electing and being elected, and of governing, and it is useless for us to state to your majesty how the bitter and unprincipled rebels would use those rights to seal your fate and that of your people. They're brilliant, right? They're saying, if you agree to this U.S. demand to restore their civil rights, Thurston, Dole, and those guys, then they're going to run for office next year and be elected by the guys that they put into the legislature. In fact, with such an amnesty, together with keeping the old constitution, our members consider that the country would be worse off than it is now, and that the past troubles would sure be repeating themselves in a very short while. And is the U.S. going to be there to reinstate the Queen again? By your majesty conceding these 2 points, if the rumor be correct, you are therefore virtually surrendering yourself and your people to the enemy, and this is sufficient to justify our alarm and the misboundings of our association. But these sentiments of ours are further increased if we give credence to the rumor that these untimely and ruinous concessions, on which the Hui Aloha Aina have not been consulted, have been counseled to your majesty by certain unrepresentative advisors, whom your majesty knows well, are disliked, mistrusted, and feared for good reasons. All your loyal subjects, those advisors have done nothing for your majesty in past crises, but cheap talk, while your majesty's strength lies in the fight made for you by Hui Aloha Aina. If your majesty is willing to run personally the dangers we allude to, it is a duty we owe to ourselves and to our families to protest, and ask that you must not jeopardize the nation's interest and future, and nullify the efforts we have made to save our country from the pirates who have seized it. The undersigned hope that your majesty will excuse this plain talk, But as they claim to have proven that none are more loyal and faithful subjects than them, they respectfully think that they are entitled to the favor of expressing before your majesty the opinions of their followers, and to a right also of being awarded some proofs of confidence and trust. Moreover, in view of the responsibilities that weigh on their shoulders through the confidence of their members of the Hui, they wish to place themselves on record as having dutifully sounded the alarm, so that they must not be blamed if the members get discouraged and apathetic when they hear that their hopes and expectations of a good, stable, and just native government are frustrated. Of your majesty, the most humble and obedient servants, Honolulu, this 9th day of December, 1893, Joseph Nawahi, J.A. Cummins, J.W. B. Picane, John E. Bush, Albert Marquez, W. Ricard, John Rolfs, and R.W. Grant. Yeah. So, it's talk about international relations, talk about knowing the law, talk about saying, if you let them go, they're just going to do it again. And not just saying it in a newspaper, but writing to the Queen to say that. That's a patriot to his nation. That's what Nawahi did.
That's courage.
So we talk, these discussions about the Queen and Kalakaua and the Hui Lohaina are all complicated discussions. We're not all always making the perfect decisions. But to know that folks like Nawahi seem to be, I can't find an instance where he didn't come up and say the voice of the people is what matters. So that's why we're here today, to honor him.
I read some books that fault the Queen for not giving in on the amnesty, but what I'm hearing from you is that there was a lot of feeling among the people that shouldn't be done.
Right. So the Conklin guys have always said, well, she was going to cut their heads off and blah blah blah. She, from the transcripts we have from the secondhand transcripts we have of her meeting, she says that she told them that she didn't have the power to do that, which is true. She couldn't just grant them amnesty. It took the legislature and stuff like that. So she says that she understood what Nawahi guys were saying and tried to do that too, but in the end, she agreed to amnesty. Now that's a political decision she made.
That means somebody else ain't gonna take them out.
But you know what I mean. So it's complicated, because you could say, if we listen to him, then maybe the U.S. doesn't agree. Maybe it's moot anyway. Who knows? But what we do know is that Nawahi and Hui Lohaina were challenging the Queen, saying, "Do this."
On that point, it just begs the question, though, the U.S. policy was that it was an act of war, and yet who is she negotiating with? She's negotiating with the U.S. The U.S. is advocating for them not to be punished, when by their own statement, this isn't their business.
Right.
Those people are Hawaiian nationals, and they should not be negotiating on their behalf. So they're taking two stands there. So what I wanted to ask you, though, was how long did the U.S. Marines stay in Hawaii? So Stevens, he comes on, but like in
when Blount brings the flag down, he orders them back on ship.
Right, and so then after that, after the Blount report comes out, what is keeping the Hawaiians from arming themselves and taking it back?
To be honest, they have no guns. After 1895 was to break the back of the resistance, and it didn't do that mentally, but it did that physically. The guns they imported from San Francisco were secondhand guns and scarecrow guns and so forth. They had plenty of people that would have fought. They didn't have the weapons to overthrow the Republic, and they didn't have the organization after that. The 189 men that were arrested as part of the Civil War, an additional over 250 men were arrested just because. And what they did was they literally went around the islands and arrested all the top Hawaiians. Not every one of them, but most of the top Hawaiians they could gather. The judges, the lawyers, the leaders, and so forth. They brought them to prison. They fined them. Most of those fines were eliminated, not collected, but they were there in case. So folks like Cummins, who has money, they collected from him. So they're taking resources, they're taking money resources. Daniels was one of the wealthiest Hawaiians around. He went broke. They ended up taking his own life. They took all the resources from Hawaiians in '95.
So this goes back a little bit, though. Hawaiians there, it's a warrior culture, right? Before Kamehameha unites everybody. Why do they not want to maintain? It's not like it's going to be hard to find warriors. Why does he not maintain some sort of a military?
You talking about Kalakaua?
Yeah, just
He-
going forward, how does that?
he
how do we
tried.
lose that?
He tried, and every time he tried, the legislature shut him down. Those are all the untold stories.
But in Kamehameha, even then, the legislature has that, like, already from the beginning, for the second, the third, they've just lost that ability to.
Well, so it's a double-edged sword. So when Kauai creates in a constitution in 1840, he's doing there's no question that was the smartest move, because Hawaii would have been taken over, no question. Gaining recognition in 43 saved the nation, but what it also did was decentralize power. So all of a sudden, in 1862, when the king wants to create a hospital for Hawaiians, he can't, because the legislature says no. Go to Tonga, the king wants to do something, it's done. So it's a double-edged sword, right? You're saving the nation by creating a so-called democracy, but you're losing some power. And by losing that power, the sons and grandsons of missionaries are now gaining more and more power, and eventually you find yourself where you can't. There's a dozen instances of Kalakaua pushing those bills. The reason he sent students abroad, he sent Wilcox to the military training in Turin, Italy. He sent the princesses to military training in San Francisco. Kalakaua floated a bill to turn Lahainaluna into a military school. He wanted to create a naval station, a naval school in Honolulu for Native Hawaiians. And as soon as Bayonet passed, they canceled all those programs. So he was trying.
Did they document?
They
They were losing legislative power from the 60s on.
But even from the first, from Liho Liho and all, it's just, but even from then, there's not the ability to.
Well, there might have been a window when there was ability to create an army, but in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s, you don't have you just don't have the resources. Like there's, that's to create an army would take decades, and would create the right, need the right laws, and no one really, and you're not that prescient. You think things are fine. We've got friends here, we got friends here, we got this treaty, we have that treaty. Once they realized that they were in trouble. That's why I said Kalakaua had that Saul-like moment. He's just, one day I think he woke up and was like, oh crap, we're in trouble. And it was too late.
Didn't they document in the legislature or in the minutes or somewhere what was the reasoning behind not creating a military? Obviously, I mean, what are you going to do with all these people who are still alive from when they were fighting? Like, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
Was the idea that just
it wasn't that they didn't want, it wasn't that they made a conscious decision not to create a military. They felt like they had a military. They had the Prince's Own, the King's Own. They had the Honolulu Rifles. They thought the Honolulu Rifles were on their side. So they had militaries out there, and the Honolulu Rifles had 400 people.
But that's the weird thing. Why let them be the Hawaii Rifles? What's the point of the Honolulu Rifles? Why not make them part of the?
Because then it's your expense.
Okay.
It wasn't. They were, as a private militia. It doesn't cost you any money.
I'm trying to understand the period after the overthrow.
Mm-hmm.
First, it was the protectorate because they were under the flag.
Right, for about a month and a half.
Okay. Then they were trying to get support from the U.S. but couldn't.
Right. So at that point, from April 1893 on, they're an independent provisional government.
But during that phase, first they're for the U.S. government, then they're against the U.S. government, then they're into martial law, and then they're not into martial law?
Right. Martial law is declared in January 1895. It ends in March 1895. So then when 1894 they created that so-called republic, right? So they're an independent nation still. Sovereignty hasn't passed, but they're a republic. They're supposedly a republic. And so they're just moving along as an independent republic, thinking, well, the U.S. doesn't want us. The U.S.'s policy is restoration. And again, I wrote an article on college debates in the U.S. over annexation. Huge. At the highest levels of academia in the U.S., they said annexation would be immoral and illegal. So the U.S. is not gonna do that. But everything changed with the Spanish-American War. All of a sudden, Hawaii becomes the spot they need for coal, going to the Philippines to fight the Filipino-American War, and that changed everything. The military need for Hawaii in 1896, 1897. And then all the anti-imperialists, all the people that saying this is immoral, screw them. We got to take Hawaii. And you saw that with the annexation hearings, right? That's why. I mean, look at that. Look at 1897, the annexation hearings. The U.S. says no.
Yeah.
The U.S. says no. It's wrong for us to take Hawaii. So we can't. I'm not defending the U.S.
I'm saying to say that the U.S. came in January 17th, 1893, and then stole the nation, that's not true.
But actually the coaling station was planned then, but didn't come about until the 20th century.
Right. Well, Pearl Harbor wasn't anything until past 1900. But it was the idea that, well, Camp McKinley and other things there in Oahu, it's a misnomer to call it the Spanish-American War. That was 4 months. This was the Filipino-American War. I mean, Aguinaldo goes to the U.S. and says, these colonial Spanish have taken us over. You guys are for the people, by the people, of the people. Defend us. The president says, you're right. We should kick out these colonizers. And they defeat the Spanish. They go to Paris to sign the treaty. And the president of the United States said he had a dream where God spoke to him and told him that the Filipinos shouldn't go free. They needed the colonial hand of America. So they buy the Philippines. Aguinaldo says, what the hell? You just got rid of the colonizer, now you're colonizing us. So they start fighting. And there's a 9-year war where 1 million Filipinos are killed. But that war was why the U.S. needed Hawaii.
And actually, if you read about that war, it sounds an awful lot like Vietnam.
Yeah,
Very much so.
Well, and Hawaii became so the the U.S. minister was involved. Then the U.S. says, it's an act of war. Then Hawaii becomes a military need, and many people in the U.S. said no, but the military in the U.S. States won out, and they stole Hawaii in 1898.
Some question.
No, go ahead.
I just wondered if he had a best friend.
It's a great question. If he had a best friend. That's a great question. It's talked about a lot that he was friends with Pilipo. Him and Pilipo. Pilipo was another legislator. He was a deacon at Kamakapili Church, actually. He was another legislator, and they were called the Lions of the legislature. So I don't know a lot about him, but I would look into Pilipo.
So we got like a couple minutes before noon. I don't want to keep you all day. I'm going to make a little plug. I hope you don't mind. I know that there are lots of people actually watching this live stream. I should say that for those of you who are teachers, or even those of you who are interested in sharing this information, ask him. He'll ask you. How can people reach you? Email.
Kuamo'olelo, 3 O's, kuamo'olelo@gmail.com. If you're a teacher in the DOE, you're welcome to have free resources that are the sets of cards I'm doing. But otherwise, any other way I can help, just let me know.
That's excellent, because I think that more people need the information. It's awesome, really good. So, and then the second part of today is that we're going to go outside and remember Joseph Nawahi at his house site. Which is a little different than the house site.
We missed it last year by a couple hundred feet, but we know we got a better map this time.
We're in the neighborhood.
Oh yeah, we're kind of not far.
And just to give you, before we go out there, so the area was upper middle class. It was Princess Ruth's home and Princess Lili Okalani's house across the street, across Pua Lane. But Princess Ruth dies. The property goes to Pauahi. She donated all her property to Pauahi, becomes part of Kamehameha Estate. Nawahi leases the property. And so he's living here at least from 1892 on. We have him in the city directory. He's living here from 1892 on. And there's a stables here, and it's a beautiful home. And it's known as a place where people go and have, there's social parties and things like that. And this was where he was arrested from this site, and this is where his funeral took place from. So we'll go out there and mark that spot.
Are there photographs in the archives of the...
There aren't. And it's all redeveloped now. So where his home was is literally underneath the street.
Yeah.
But we know where the spot is. We have a map.
Sounds like a street shutdown to me.
All right. So, and we're going to videotape out there.
Oh.
All right.
Time to shut down.